That's great. Okay, so hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Helen Chapman, YLTSIG Joint Events Coordinator, and I'd like to welcome you to our 2019 web conference. Our first 30-minute talk today is jointly delivered by Coimbra and James Taylor. Ila has been an English teacher since 2001 and a teacher trainer since 2011. She is based in Munich, Germany, holds Cambridge Delta Module 2, CELTA and CPE. She is also one of the founding members of YLTSIG Voices SIG, a special interest group that focuses on equality in ELT. James is an EFL teacher, teacher trainer, materials writer and podcast producer based in Brasilia, Brazil. In 2018, he self-published his first ebook, How Was Your Weekend?, and produces the Elton-nominated TEFL Commute and Developod podcast. He is a committee member of IATEFL TD SIG and YLTSIG Brasilia. Over to you, Ila and James.
Thank you very much, Helen, for introducing us, and thanks everyone for being here on a Sunday. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And I'm going to start talking about diversity and inclusion in the teenage classroom. And what we are going to be looking at today is I'll be talking about why and how we should teach inclusively and bring more accurate representation to the classroom. And then I'll pass it on to James, and he's going to talk a little bit about Rise Up, a project that we develop, and how to get involved in that project. So I'm not going to take much longer to start, and I'm going to start with a personal anecdote. This is me when I was about 3 or 4 or 5 years old, I don't quite remember, and I was playing in a playground with my sister. And I am the one wearing the hoodie thing, the green hoodie hat thing. And the reason why I was wearing that hoodie is because, as you can see, I have curly hair, and I didn't want to comb my hair on that day. And because the way my mom combed it, it hurt because, you know, curly hair. So she made me wear that hoodie, which I didn't like, so much so that by the middle of the day, I took it off, and that's where you can see how my natural hair, uncombed, looked like. The thing is, this is my hair, and if you grew up in Brazil in the 80s, you would be exposed to some of these people. These are TV show hosts for children in the 80s in Brazil, and you can clearly see that they are a little bit different in terms of hair and body type from what I looked like. Also, the toys that I played with when I was young, and most children around me played with, not only in Brazil but around the world, also have certain type of hair, certain type of body, and certain skin colors, and etc. However, I grew up, and this is me at the age of 13 when I was in school already. So as you can clearly see, I didn't fit those images that we saw before, and those images were considered the normal, the model, the expected looks of people. The thing is, when I started going to school and being there with my non-conventional body type and my non-conventional hair, because the convention were those images that we saw, I started being teased, and I started being bullied for that. And I was not the only one. Also, there were several people with different skin colors, with different body types, with different way to dress, with different identities, with different hairstyles. They were also bullied and teased because they didn't fit. They were different from what was considered the model, different from what was considered the normal. So when we think about bringing representation, bringing diversity and more accurate representation to our classroom, we are thinking about avoiding big cases of bullying, because the people, children and teenagers grow up grew up with certain images, and if we expose them to different images, we might get more diverse images, they might not tease or not see the other different things as different or as things that should not be there. There are studies that link bullying with social representation, social misrepresentations, and I like this quote of Thornburg because he links some bullying causes to a misrepresentation of our society. So this is fact number one we should take into consideration when teaching inclusively. That brings diverse to the classroom, so the difference are not seen as different, so the cases of bullying might be reduced. Now I'm going to move on to another childhood anecdote, but not mine, Whoopi Goldberg. And this is her reaction to, this is the story she tells about the reaction she had when she saw Uhura from Star Trek, the original series, which was a black woman official of communications in the Starship Enterprise, and she was a black woman. And when she saw that, she knew right then and there she could be anything she wanted to be, because so far she could see herself only as maid or only as sidekicks in movies and TV. So if we transfer that to our classroom, we are going to think that there is a quote that says, you can't be it and if you can't see it. So if our students don't see themselves represented in the classroom, in the school community, in the materials we use, they might not see themselves, nor identify themselves with what we are teaching, nor identify themselves with the English-speaking world, not identify themselves with the language, with the culture that we are teaching. And I like very much this quote from John Gray. Let me move on here. Here in this quote, he's talking about LGBT students, but I think we can think of any other group of people that are not viewed as the normals. So what happens when our students are not represented in our class, in our classroom, in our lessons, in the materials, and in the school community? They first might feel silenced, as they are, because they don't have active voice there. Secondly, according to Gray, still according to Gray, these students might be forced into challenging the way that they are represented. So we have conflict in the classroom because students want and need they might be that might lead to conflict. This is what I wanted to say, because they need to challenge the way they are represented. And another thing that can happen also, if there's no conflict to challenge that there might be passive resistance from the students to the subject matter we are teaching, to the classroom routines, to the school environment, and to the school community. So when you think about teaching inclusively, we are thinking also about motivating your students, about acknowledge their identities, and about making them feel they are in a safe environment when they are in the school, in the classroom, and in the school community. But how do we do that, right? These are the whys. Why should we teach inclusively, and why should we think about diversity in our classroom? But how should we do that? There are some things that we have to take into consideration when teaching teenagers, but we can also think about, as somebody said in the chat, any foreign language teaching classroom. So these are some ways that we can think about how to build an inclusive classroom. The first thing we need to take into consideration is to keep a multicultural routine. First, when I say multicultural, I'm not talking about food and eating habits only, right? Which is part of culture, but not only. I'm talking about identity. I'm talking about religion. I'm talking about sexuality. I'm talking about gender identity. I'm talking about physical traits such as body type, such as hair type. All these things are included in the definition of culture. And our students with different cultural background should be able to expose this and should be able to be exposed to different different cultures and backgrounds on a daily basis as a routine, not as a one-day event in the year, in the school calendar, that we're going to have a multicultural fair. So this has to be part of the classroom routine. Secondly, we have to provide our students a safe environment. And how do we do that? First, provide them with opportunities to share their differences. Provide them with opportunity to share facts about their culture and celebrate those differences. Third, right? Explicitly tackle any comment that is negative towards difference, that contains any kind of biases or any type of stereotypes. We as teachers, we are the model, so we shouldn't accept any kind of comment, especially in these moments that we are talking about differences and multicultural backgrounds. We should not, it has to be clear that biases and negative comments about those differences are not welcome in our classroom. Next, when there is this multicultural difference sharing, we have as teachers to show genuine interest in their differences and their background and celebrate those differences and background. We ourselves as teachers. Why is that? Again, we are the model. So if we reinforce a positive attitude towards these differences, we are conveying the message that the differences are welcome. And last but not least, we should have and keep high expectations of our students. We teachers need to tackle our own personal biases and see and question ourselves, do I expect the same performance from this student and from that student, or do I unconsciously have lower expectations because I have my own biases? Again, one more time, it doesn't kill to say again, we are the models, and we need to show that we believe in our students the way they are, not taking into consideration any difference. And also that should happen in the school community. Involving the school community in these discussions, in this multicultural routine, in this sharing is of high importance to make our students feel comfortable and feel safe in our classroom. And now I'd like to conclude my part by quoting Verinder when she says about an inclusive school or an inclusive classroom. This inclusion will only be successful when all the students feel they are part, feel they belong to the school community. And again, if we have a school community that brings an accurate representation of society, the students will never feel welcome and will never feel truly part of the school community. And then Verinder goes on saying that this inclusion can only happen through open, honest discussion about differences, about respecting people, and about understanding the differences. Different costumes, different cultures, different body types, different hair, different way to dress, different religion, different identities, different sexualities in the classroom. And then, just to wrap this up, an inclusive environment is where everyone feels valued. It means that teachers and school directors and all people in the school have the same high expectation from all the students in the community. So these are the things that I think we should take into consideration when we think about inclusion and diversity. In the teenager classroom, of course, but that goes for as somebody said again in the chat, for any language classroom, even if you teach in a monocultural environment. Somebody has just said that in Peru there are different native languages and indeed different cultural backgrounds. Even if we teach in the same country, this is also valid. Bearing these reasons in mind, James and I, we started developing materials to be used in the English classroom that are more inclusive. And now I'd like to pass it on to James because he's going to present the project that we have created.
Thank you, Ilar. Okay, so as Ilar mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the materials that we created. But firstly, Ilar's been talking about different identities, so let's just take a look at that for a second and exactly what we mean. And in creating this project, we decided that we looked at two different areas, right? Basically, areas where coursebooks have and materials have improved over the years, and areas where we think there are still considerable weaknesses, right? So in the areas of improvements, in these places, we think if you compare coursebooks from the 70s until today, there have been quite considerable improvements in the representation of these groups. It's not perfect, and it certainly isn't finished, a long way from it, but it's better than it used to be. But when it comes to the groups which we identify as weaknesses, we would say that these are still areas where there's been very little progress, or maybe even none at all. And what you often find is that these are groups of people that, if they appear in lesson materials, either they don't appear at all, they're completely invisible, or they're people that are presented in very kind of limited ways. So, for example, you might see disabled people or elderly people, but they're often there because they've managed to achieve something in spite of their age or their disability. So they're sort of presented as inspirational stories, which we feel is very limited. So these are the groups that we think where improvement needs to happen. So what we decided to do was to create this book called Raise Up. And I'm just going to very quickly explain what it is and what it's about. And in case you're a bit worried, I'm going to do some big commercial things here now. This is a self-published project between Ilar and I, and all the money that we raise goes to charity. For this edition of the book, it goes to the Casa Um project in Sao Paulo. So you can forgive me for telling you about the book, because it's all for charity, right? So, as you can see, the book is described as a diverse and inclusive view of English. And then what do we have? So in the book, we have the lessons. There are 8 lessons, and these basically have 2 focuses, right? So the first focus is on the subject of the lesson, and then the second one is in the social group that we decided to represent in that book. So, as you can see, there are different varieties. So we've got, a lesson about family, which includes LGBT. We've got a lesson about texting, which includes refugees, and so on. These are 8 individual lessons. They're at different levels. They're standalone. So the idea is that a teacher can take that lesson and use it to amend the classroom materials. So, in the book, this is one of the lessons, lesson 7, the one about texting and refugees I mentioned. So you can see it looks very familiar. If you're used to an ELT course book, it should be very familiar to you. And the idea is, this is very deliberate. The idea is that it basically follows the design and the method of a mainstream ELT international course book. So what we're trying to do here is 2 things. One, we want to create materials for teachers to be able to use, so that if teachers want to use inclusive materials, something is available to them. And secondly, what we want to achieve is to show people that you can make inclusive materials and lessons without it having to be a big controversial thing. These are lessons which any teacher should be able to teach in many, many places, and it shouldn't be a difficult thing to do, because both the way it looks and the way the lesson is designed and ordered should be very, very familiar. So when you create materials like this, if this is something that you're thinking about doing, there's something you have to consider seriously, which is how do you approach the lesson design, okay? The approaches to representation. So, excuse me. So one approach, let me drink some water. So one approach you can take is to be inclusive. And this is the main approach that we've taken in the book. So you can have lessons which are about people from different social groups, but are not about their issues particularly. It just includes those people in a way that international course books always include people without being focused on those issues. The other approach you can take is to take a problematized approach, where you look at the specific social group and then you look at the problems that those groups have. So, for example, if it was to do with disabled people, you might look at how they have difficulty, accessing buildings, or problems in finding work, or something like this, right? So those are two possible approaches. They're both perfectly valid. You've got a choice how you go about it. But what you mustn't do, though, is you mustn't do this. Okay? So this is an example from a course book, and this is an example of someone who's trying to use a problematized approach. Yes? And what they've chosen to do here is give students the opportunity to tick the option here which they agree with, which reflects their opinion. And unfortunately, this includes things like absolutely not, homosexuality is wrong, or I say no, it makes me really uncomfortable to be around people who are homosexuals. And if you think back to what Ilau was saying earlier about how our students feel in the classroom, how do you think a homosexual student would feel in a classroom where this was available for the students? I think that would make them feel very upset and very vulnerable in a way that as teachers we should never want our students to feel. Right? And so what this does, this activity, is it validates an opinion which is frankly should not be acceptable in our classrooms. It shouldn't be there. So as materials writers, we have to be very, very careful about how we deal with these kind of activities. We have to be very sensitive. And as Judy Boyle, who's also speaking at this conference, has said, we have to be careful not to re-exploit their pain just because it makes like a good grammar point, right? We have to be empathetic and think about justice and etc. first, yes? So we have to be very careful. And in that example that I just showed you, that terrible example, to be frank, that was about gay students, but it could apply to any social of those groups that I mentioned before, right? Imagine if it was about race or gender or class, etc. It's utterly unacceptable, and we mustn't, as teachers, give a space to those views in our lessons. So how we did it in how we did it in Raise Up was, this is going back to the refugee lesson, is that we, so here you can see in this lesson, 4, 5, 6 and 7 are about are activities that are not about refugees. They're including a refugee in them, but they're not about refugees. So this is an example of an inclusive approach. And most of the book is like this. Occasionally, and this is one example, we do a more problematized thing. And you can see that here beginning in activity 8. It's asking the students to imagine what's going to happen next in Nadia's story. And it continues. And in these activities, students are being asked to consider what can happen to her. They're being asked to empathize. And then by the end, in number 11, the students are asked to imagine what would they do in that situation if they were in a situation like that. So we're trying to get the students in a position where they begin to understand what refugees are going through. So this is a problematized approach, but it's much more sensitive than the horrible example I showed you before. And so we are aware with these materials that, of course, what you're able to do is very dependent on your context, right? It's not easy for everyone, depending on where you live in the world and the political environment at the time and the institution where you work and what your students are like, and the parents, and there are many factors involved. And so we're aware that not everyone is in the same situation. So what we're saying here is we want you to be brave. And this was the quote that John Gray, who Ilan mentioned earlier, gave at the end of his plenary at IATEFL this year, where he talked about, in order to make some progress with this, then bravery is required, right? It's not going to be an easy thing for us necessarily to do. But everyone involved, from teachers to publishers to school owners to editors and even to the students themselves, we're going to need to be brave and try and push it as far as we can within our sphere of influence. We have to try and do what we can if we believe this is important, as we do. So, what can you do? Well, firstly, obviously, buy the book. That would be nice. As I said, all the money goes to charity. And the link is here at tailormadeenglish.com/raiseup. You can also help us spread the word. As I said, this book is just published by Ilan and I independently. It's a PDF that you download. And if you believe in this, if you think that this is an important thing, then tell people about it. Send them an email, share it on social media, do whatever you can. You can also contribute. So your contributions, we're going to do future editions of Raise Up. We're currently in the process of creating a B1 and a B2 book, and we are going to do future versions. And so we want you to, if you want to write for us a lesson, something that you care about, let us know, get involved. You can also contribute as a photographer, illustrator, editor, proofreader. We need people to help us. So, or graphic designer, please get in touch or let someone know if you think they would be interested in doing any of those things. And then finally, there you go. There's the final slide. So that's how you get the book. That's all the contact information for us. So thank you very much. There you go, Helen. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much to James and Ila. Really interesting, very personal approach, I think, from Ila. And then James, really, I find it fascinating when you looked at what not to do and actually how everyone can maybe have good intentions for inclusivity, but actually there are definitely examples out there of how it shouldn't be done. So thank you very much. And now we're going to have a 5-minute break before the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Bye-bye.